I stood at the edge of the cemetery that morning, the damp autumn air hanging heavy with the smell of wet leaves and stone, and I realized with a kind of hollow clarity that the silence pressing against my ears would be my only constant companion from now on. For more than 50 years my wife, Margaret, had been the one to speak first at breakfast, the one to hum softly as she folded the laundry, the one to fill every corner of our little lakefront home in Michigan with an atmosphere that made even the harshest winter storms feel like they were happening outside someone else's walls. And now, without her, each hour stretched before me like a corridor with no doors, each minute echoing with the reminder that I had been left behind, that my heart still beat while hers had ceased. I am 82 years old, and though I have tried to convince myself that old age is merely another season, to endure with dignity, I find myself struggling with the truth that it is instead a narrowing tunnel in which light vanishes more quickly than one expects. The cruelest part of it all is not the frailty of the body, nor the limitations that arthritis, poor eyesight, and unreliable knees impose upon me, but the way the familiar world transforms overnight into a landscape both foreign and hostile, because the one who once made it feel safe and recognizable has been taken away. Margaret's death did not come suddenly. Cancer rarely affords its victims that mercy. We had watched the disease carve away her strength inch by inch, week after week, and though I tried to put on a mask of courage for her, she could always read my eyes. Even when her voice became thin as paper, she would still whisper that everything was going to be all right, that I would learn how to get along without her, that she trusted me to live with grace. But the truth, which I have not admitted to anyone but myself, is that I have failed to believe her. Every room in our home feels colder, every ritual emptier. I make my own coffee now in the mornings, pouring the hot water slowly over the grounds the way she once did. Yet the taste never comes out right, because no hand can mimic the warmth that was in hers. I set the table for one, though my instinct still reaches for a second plate, and each time I correct myself, I feel another little fracture spreading through the surface of my chest. Nights are the worst, because the house that once vibrated with Margaret's laughter lies still as a mausoleum, and when the furnace groans, I sometimes startle awake, half expecting to hear her call out, only to remember that she will never call again. My daughter, Lauren, knew her mother was dying, but she did not come often. She lives in another state, in Ohio, with her fiancé, a man who introduced himself to me only once with a handshake that felt as insincere as the smile he wore. I told myself not to judge too quickly, that perhaps modern ways are different, that perhaps young people have their own manner of showing respect. Yet there was something in his eyes that unsettled me, a calculating gleam that seemed less interested in family than in assessment, as if he were adding numbers in his head even while exchanging pleasantries. Lauren, my only child, has not called me Dad with warmth in many years. Instead, she speaks briskly, almost like a business associate scheduling a meeting, and though I do not doubt that somewhere deep within her there remains the girl who once clutched my hand on the boardwalk, pointing out sailboats with excitement, that girl has become difficult to find beneath the sharp tone and practiced indifference. When Margaret still lived, she would excuse Lauren's distance by saying that our daughter was busy, that she had her own life, that we should not expect her to hover like a dutiful child from old stories. Margaret's eyes, however, betrayed the sorrow she carried, for she longed to see more of our grandchildren, to hear laughter in the house again, to feel as though all those decades of sacrifice had yielded a family bound by more than blood and obligations. I remember nights when Margaret would sit in her armchair with a photo album open on her knees, pretending she was only reminiscing, but I would notice the way her thumb lingered on a picture of Lauren as a smiling teenager, and I knew she was grieving the absence of that once tender closeness. I would put a hand on her shoulder, and she would smile through tears and say, "She'll come around, Walter. She'll remember who we are to her." Yet even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction, and the years taught us that the distance only grew. After Margaret's funeral, which was a modest service attended mostly by old neighbors, church friends, and the few surviving relatives who cared enough to travel, I returned to the house alone. The floor creaked in the same places. The lake outside whispered against the shore, as it always had. But everything had changed. The refrigerator still carried Margaret's handwriting on sticky notes, lists of groceries, little reminders to water the ferns, and each time I passed them, I felt as though I were trespassing in a shrine. I tried to keep busy, to sweep the porch, to mend a loose hinge on the shed door, but even the most ordinary tasks echoed with the emptiness of doing them for no one but myself. The absence of purpose gnawed at me more fiercely than loneliness. For what is an old man without someone to care for? Without someone who cares whether his chair is empty at dinner? That first week after her burial, I thought often of selling the house, of moving into some smaller place in town, where perhaps I might see familiar faces and not feel swallowed by silence. Yet I knew deep down that Margaret's presence still lived in every corner of that house, and to abandon it so quickly would be a betrayal. So I stayed, tending to the little routines with mechanical precision, even as I felt myself fading into a shadow of the man I once was. I did not expect company, nor did I receive much. A neighbor might wave from across the street, the pastor might stop by with polite words, but mostly I lived inside a bubble of quiet reflection, asking questions that had no answers, such as whether Margaret knew in her final hours how desperately I would miss her, or whether I had said enough, done enough, loved enough to ease her fears as she slipped away. It was during those days of oppressive silence that Lauren finally called, her voice sharp and oddly impatient, as though even mourning required her to squeeze time from her busy schedule. She said she would come up for the weekend, that she wanted to pay her respects at her mother's grave, and for a fleeting moment my heart lifted, thinking perhaps grief would soften her. Perhaps she would arrive not as the brisk professional I had come to know, but as the daughter who once pressed flowers into her mother's hands with delight. I spent the following days polishing the silverware, preparing Margaret's favorite casserole, and even trimming the hedges, foolishly hoping that my effort might rekindle some sense of family. But when Lauren arrived, stepping from her sleek car with her fiancé at her side, her first words were not of comfort or memory. She hugged me stiffly, the way one greets a distant relative at a reunion, and her eyes swept over the house not with nostalgia, but with a kind of appraisal, as though she were calculating square footage and potential value. At the cemetery, where I had gone countless times in the weeks since Margaret's burial to speak softly to her, to feel less alone by addressing her stone, Lauren stood beside me in silence for a long moment. Then, as I adjusted the flowers at the base of the headstone, she asked in a voice so casual it froze my blood, "Dad, have you decided who gets the money?" The words echoed in my skull like a church bell struck out of rhythm, reverberating with such coldness that for a moment I wondered if I had misheard. I turned to look at her, and she did not even flinch, as though the question were natural, as though the presence of her mother's grave, still fresh with turned earth, was no barrier to financial inquiries. My chest tightened, not only from the cruelty of the timing, but from the realization that Margaret had been right all along. Our daughter had become practical to the point of callousness, calculating in a way that stripped flesh from bone. In that instant, as the wind rustled through the oaks and the fiancé's hand rested casually on her shoulder, I understood that my loneliness was not merely the result of Margaret's passing, but of a deeper abandonment that had taken place years ago, one that now revealed itself with merciless clarity. When the words slipped from my daughter's mouth at the cemetery, I felt an invisible hand close tightly around my throat, and though the autumn wind rustled through the branches above us, carrying the brittle scent of decaying leaves, I could barely breathe under the weight of what she had just said. I had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that our visit to Margaret's grave might create a moment of quiet intimacy, that standing before the stone which bore her name would stir even the faintest glimmer of tenderness in Lauren, and that we might share a memory or two, as people do when grief loosens their defenses. Instead, I stood there watching my daughter study the engraved letters as though they were simply another detail in a contract, something to acknowledge before moving on to more practical matters. Her question about money, about inheritance, about what remained of a life, did not just strike me as premature. It struck me as obscene, as if she were plucking the last flowers from Margaret's coffin while the soil had yet to settle. I wanted to lash out, to say that her mother's spirit deserved more than such mercenary curiosity. But the words caught in my throat, because beneath my anger I felt a deeper sorrow. The recognition that perhaps Margaret had seen this coldness forming years ago and had simply hoped against hope that it would thaw. I looked at Lauren's face, once soft and bright with youthful wonder, now hardened by years of ambition and calculation, and I realized that nothing I could say in that moment would summon back the daughter who used to cry when she scraped her knee, who used to rush into her mother's arms after school. Her fiancé, standing just behind her, gave me a quick glance that was not sympathetic but appraising, as though he wanted to see how I would react, as though he were silently judging whether the bait had been taken. I mumbled something evasive, that the matter had not been settled, that there would be time enough to think about it later, and then I busied myself with arranging the flowers, in a desperate attempt to avoid her gaze. She nodded curtly, as if my answer had been sufficient, and then turned back toward the car, leaving me to follow like an old man shuffled along by the tide of his own family's indifference. On the drive back to the house, Lauren filled the silence with chatter about the renovations she and her fiancé were planning for their condominium in Ohio, about the new job offer she had received at a larger firm, about the possibilities of moving into a bigger home in a more prestigious neighborhood. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing trees, listening to her words, not as the excited updates of a daughter eager to share her life, but as the calculated monologue of someone auditioning for a future that required resources she clearly believed should come from me. That evening she cooked dinner in my kitchen, moving briskly about the counters as though the space already belonged to her. She opened drawers without asking, commented that the appliances were outdated, and remarked that the house would fetch a good price if I ever decided to sell. Her fiancé poured wine with a polished smile, telling me that it was important for older people to think about simplifying their lives, that the burden of maintaining property could become overwhelming, and that sometimes the wisest thing to do was to let the younger generation take responsibility for such matters. His words carried the smooth cadence of someone who had rehearsed them, and I could not help but feel that they had been preparing this script long before Margaret's body was even lowered into the ground. I ate little that night, pushing food around my plate, while Lauren described how, if I moved to Ohio, she and her fiancé could look after me properly, how I would never be alone, how they would ensure that I had the best care available, all while emphasizing the convenience it would bring if everything I owned were consolidated under her supervision. Each phrase was dressed in the clothing of concern, Yet underneath I could hear the unmistakable clink of coins, the calculation of how my existence could be translated into assets, how my presence could be converted into property and accounts. I smiled faintly, nodding, offering no resistance, for I knew that to confront them directly in that moment would only expose my suspicion, and something in me told me it would be wiser to listen, to wait, to see just how far they were willing to go. That night after they retired to the guest room, I sat in my armchair with the lights turned low and Margaret's photograph resting in my hands. I whispered to her that our daughter had asked about money at her grave, and though I knew she could not answer, I felt in the silence a kind of affirmation, as if she too had expected this betrayal and was urging me not to close my eyes to it. I thought of the years we had spent building a modest fortune, not extravagant, but enough to provide comfort and security. The sale of the family business, the careful investments, the savings that Margaret had managed with her meticulous handwriting and ledgers, all of it had been meant not just for us, but as a legacy of love, a safety net for those we cherished. To see that legacy reduced to a bargaining chip in Lauren's conversation felt like the most bitter desecration of Margaret's memory. In the following days, Lauren lingered, offering to drive me to the grocery store, insisting on going through stacks of old paperwork in the study, asking where I kept important documents. She handled envelopes and folders with the air of someone already cataloging possessions, while her fiancé dropped hints about financial planning, about the risks of old age, about the dangers of leaving matters unsettled. They spoke with a confidence that betrayed not love, but entitlement, as if everything had already been quietly promised to them, and they were merely smoothing the way for an inevitable transfer. I listened, nodded, pretended to be grateful, but each night when I closed the door to my bedroom, I felt the pressure of anger and sorrow building within me, a pressure that whispered of betrayal deeper than words could capture. One evening, I passed by the guest room and heard voices, low and urgent, filtering through the thin wooden door. I paused, my breath caught, and pressed my ear closer, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. Lauren was telling her fiancé that it was only a matter of time before I slipped, before I forgot something crucial, before a doctor's note could be used to prove I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. "He's already getting confused," she said, her tone clipped. "He repeats himself. He stares off into space. It won't be hard to convince people he needs someone to handle things for him." Her fiancé chuckled softly, replying that once the paperwork was signed, once the accounts were consolidated, they would finally have the freedom to do what they wanted. I felt my knees tremble, not from age, but from the cold shock of betrayal. I staggered back down the hall, each step weighted with the realization that my daughter was plotting not to care for me, but to erase me, to transform my life's work into a resource for her ambitions. Standing alone in the darkness of my study, I looked once more at Margaret's photograph and swore silently that I would not let them strip away what we had built together. At that moment, I knew with absolute clarity that I had to act, not merely to protect the money, but to protect the dignity of a life that Margaret and I had labored to craft with honesty and love. And so, the seed of decision took root in me, nourished by outrage and sorrow. I would change my will. I would alter the course they believed was already set, and in doing so, I would reclaim the final measure of control that age and grief had threatened to steal from me. They thought me weak, confused, pliable, but I would show them that even an old man broken by loss can still rise when memory, dignity, and love demand it. The morning after I overheard their conversation, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before I remembered to drink it. staring at the steamless surface and wondering when exactly my daughter had crossed the invisible line between the child I once tucked into bed and the stranger who now circled my life like a vulture waiting for the last breath. The ache of that realization was almost worse than the grief of losing Margaret, because death is an act of nature, but betrayal is an act of choice, and choice speaks to character, to the moral fiber of a soul. Lauren descended the stairs with the brisk energy of someone preparing for another day of conquest, her fiancé close behind, and she asked me with studied casualness if I had thought about her suggestion, if I had considered simplifying matters by letting her take over the financial responsibilities. And her fiancé added smoothly that there were so many pitfalls in today's market that it was unwise for an elderly man to manage things alone. I nodded vaguely, murmuring something non-committal, while inside me the decision hardened like cooling iron. I would listen, I would watch, and I would wait until the moment arrived when they revealed their hand fully, because then I would have proof of what I already knew in my heart. Over the following days their visits became a performance of filial care, a pantomime so transparent that even a stranger might have seen the outline of the script beneath the dialogue. Lauren fussed over the medication bottles on the counter, rearranging them as though I were incapable of reading labels, telling me that memory lapses were normal at my age and that I should be careful not to confuse one pill for another. She insisted on driving me to the store, chastising me gently in the parking lot for walking too slowly, for forgetting where the car was parked, though in truth I had not forgotten. I was simply moving at the pace my bones allowed. Her fiancé peppered me with questions about the accounts, the insurance policies, the title to the house, always phrased as though he were only curious, only thinking of my best interests, but his eyes gleamed with anticipation, and I could feel the unspoken hunger in each query. The small humiliations began to mount like snowflakes that seem harmless until you realize you are buried under their weight. At dinner, Lauren corrected me when I misremembered the name of a restaurant we had once visited, saying in a voice pitched to be light but edged with steel that it was only natural for me to forget details. And her fiancé laughed too quickly, turning my human error into a signpost of decline. One afternoon, while I rested in my chair by the window, Lauren came into the room and, without asking, took the photograph of Margaret from the mantel, saying it would be safer in an album because the frame might fall. I told her to put it back, my voice sharper than I had intended, and I saw in her eyes not guilt but calculation, as though she were noting a symptom, filing away a moment of irritability to be used later as evidence of instability. That night I lay awake listening to the muffled sound of their laughter from the guest room, laughter that no longer sounded like family but like accomplices congratulating each other. The escalation came more clearly one afternoon when Lauren suggested we go through my old papers in the study. She said it would help her understand what needed attention, that she could create a neat system, that it would relieve me of stress. I allowed it, curious to see how far she would go, and sat silently as she rifled through the drawers, stacking envelopes, pulling out files, her fiancé occasionally leaning over her shoulder with murmured comments. They lingered over the deed to the house, exchanging a look that needed no words, and Lauren remarked that property values in the area had risen dramatically, that I might be surprised how much the place was worth. She suggested selling and moving into something smaller, more manageable, and when I asked where she imagined I should live, she smiled thinly and said that of course I could stay with them until we found the right place, that they would never leave me alone. Her fiancé added that proximity to family was the best medicine for aging parents, and I almost laughed at the irony, because never had I felt so far from family as in that moment. It was during that same search that Lauren found an old letter from the insurance company, one that Margaret had kept neatly filed and she read it aloud, as though testing the sound of the numbers. She whistled softly, her fiancé's eyebrows lifting with something close to triumph, and she turned to me with a brightness that chilled me more than any winter gust. "Dad, you don't really need all this for yourself, do you?" The question hung in the room like smoke, suffocating in its presumption, and I simply folded my hands to keep them from trembling, murmuring that we would talk later. She accepted this with a smile too quick, as though she already counted the money in her head, and I realized that her patience was not patience at all, but strategy, the slow tightening of a noose. One evening, perhaps thinking I was asleep, I heard them in the kitchen, their voices low but urgent, and I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. Lorne was saying that the sooner we acted, the easier it would be. The doctors were usually willing to sign papers if the family insisted. That once guardianship was granted, everything else would fall into place. Her fiancé reminded her that it had to look natural, that any sudden moves would draw suspicion, and Lorne replied with irritation that I was already showing signs, that anyone who spent an hour with me could see it. I sat in the dark of my room, staring at the ceiling, realizing that my own daughter was preparing to declare me unfit, to strip from me not just my possessions, but my very autonomy, and that she would do it under the guise of care, smiling to neighbors and relatives about her devotion, even as she dismantled my life piece by piece. The knowledge did not crush me as I might have expected. Instead, it sharpened me, burned away the fog of grief, and replaced it with a resolve as fierce as any I had felt in my youth. I understood then that the time for passivity had passed, that I could no longer simply nod and smile and hope the storm would pass. Margaret's face came to me in memory, her eyes soft yet firm, and I knew she would want me to stand, to protect what we had built together. The escalation of their schemes had forced me into clarity, and though I was weary, though my body was frail, my mind remained my own, and with that mind I would fight back. For the first time since Margaret's passing, I felt not only grief, but purpose, a purpose born of betrayal, and it stiffened my spine as I prepared for what would come. The breaking point came one evening when Lorne returned from town carrying a neat leather folder and an expression that betrayed too much eagerness to be mistaken for anything but strategy. And she announced with forced cheer that she had spoken to a lawyer, a family friend of her fiancé's, who could assist in organizing my estate, and that it would be best, she explained with a voice polished into false gentleness, to sign a few preliminary papers just to ensure that everything was secure, just to prevent confusion later, just to make sure that Margaret's wishes, as she called them, would be honored. The word stung, because she invoked Margaret's name like a shield, twisting my wife's memory into a tool of persuasion, and I sat there watching her lay the folder on the table as though she were offering me an opportunity rather than a demand. Her fiancé leaned forward with the smooth confidence of a salesman, pointing out where signatures would go, explaining how certain clauses simplified matters, insisting that all of this was common sense, and I felt the walls of my own home pressing in, as though I were a stranger being cornered. I asked to look through the documents alone, pretending fatigue, and when they left the room, I opened the folder with hands that trembled, not from age, but from the realization of how close they had come to stealing everything I had left. The papers were not preliminary at all, but a full transfer of authority, granting Lorne complete control over my accounts, my house, my insurance, even my medical decisions. The language was wrapped in the polite silk of legal phrasing, but the intent was naked. Once I signed, I would no longer exist as a man with agency. I would become a dependent, a ward, a vessel emptied of rights. My chest tightened, my breath shallow, but along with the fear came a clarity sharper than any I had known in years. They believed me weak, but they had made their move too soon, revealing the depth of their ambition. And now I knew with certainty what I must do. That night, when the house was quiet, I retrieved the small camera I had once bought for Margaret when she wanted to record the grandchildren's visits, and I placed it carefully behind the books on the study shelf, its lens pointed toward the table. I decided that if they returned with papers, if they pressed me again, I would play the part of the hesitant but pliable old man. I would allow them to speak freely, to expose themselves, and I would capture every word, every gesture, every shred of evidence that revealed their true intentions. It was a dangerous game for a man of my age, but I felt Margaret's presence steadying me, whispering that it was the only way to defend the dignity of our lives together. The following morning I told Lauren that I was willing to consider her proposal, that perhaps she was right, that perhaps I was no longer capable of handling everything alone. Her eyes lit with triumph, though she tried to hide it beneath a veil of concern, and she promised she would arrange for the lawyer to return. Her fiancé squeezed her hand in what he thought was a subtle gesture, but I saw the spark of victory in his expression, and I knew they believed the battle already won. That evening, as I sat in the study with the camera silently recording, they laid the documents before me again, explaining clause after clause with the ease of conspirators certain of their success. I nodded, feigned confusion, asked them to repeat details, letting them dig deeper into their own deception. And when they finally urged me to sign, I picked up the pen with deliberate slowness, hovering above the line long enough for the lens to drink in their anticipation. Then, instead of signing, I set the pen down and told them gently that I would need a little more time. Their disappointment was masked with tight smiles, but I could feel the tension vibrating in the air as they gathered the papers, assuring me there was no rush, though their eyes betrayed impatience. When they left for the evening, I retrieved the camera and watched the recording, my heart pounding as their voices filled the room again. The footage showed exactly what I needed. Lauren pressing me to sign, her fiancé outlining how guardianship would make everything easier, both of them speaking as though my incapacity were already established fact. It was not just betrayal now, it was evidence, proof of intent. I transferred the video to a secure drive, locked it in the drawer with Margaret's letters, and felt for the first time since her death that I was not entirely powerless. The true midpoint of this ordeal, however, did not come from the documents alone, but from the conversation I overheard the next day while walking past the porch. Lauren was on the phone, her voice low but urgent, telling someone, I assumed the lawyer, that her father was deteriorating quickly, that he was confused most of the time, that he had misplaced bills and forgotten conversations, and that it was only a matter of weeks before he would need full supervision. I stopped cold, clutching the porch railing, realizing that she was not only preparing to control my estate, but was already constructing the narrative of my decline, laying the foundation for legal action to declare me unfit. To hear my own daughter paint me as feeble, delusional, incapable, while I stood there clear-minded and broken-hearted, was to experience a betrayal so profound it almost robbed me of breath. That night I could not sleep. I walked through the rooms of the house like a ghost, touching the furniture Margaret had chosen, the curtains she had sewn, the china she had polished, and I swore to her in the silence that I would not let our life's work be reduced to a carcass picked clean by ambition. I sat at the desk and drafted a letter to my lawyer, explaining the situation in careful detail, attaching the evidence I had gathered, and requesting an immediate appointment to revise my will. I wrote not with the trembling hand of defeat, but with the steady resolve of a man who knows his enemies are under his roof and who refuses to surrender without resistance. The midpoint of my story was not the moment I realized Lauren wanted my money. That had been clear enough at the grave. But the moment I understood that she was willing to erase me entirely to obtain it, to twist the law, to falsify my mind, to cast her own father as incompetent. In that moment, grief transformed into determination, sorrow into strategy. I no longer thought of myself as an old man waiting quietly for the end. I thought of myself as a guardian of Margaret's memory, of our sacrifices, of the love that had built every brick of that house. They believed me weak, but the truth was that I had never felt more awake. And as I sealed the envelope for the lawyer, I felt the first flicker of something like victory. Not yet won, not yet safe, but possible. And that possibility was enough to keep me standing. The following weeks unfolded with the kind of tension that seeps into every corner of a house, the kind that turns the ticking of the clock into a reminder that time is not simply passing, but tightening, that the hours themselves are conspiring with betrayal. Lauren continued her visits under the pretense of care, and I allowed them to continue, for I understood that their overconfidence was the greatest weapon I possessed, and the more they revealed of their schemes, the stronger my position would become when the moment arrived to strike back. Yet with each passing day the charade grew heavier, and I found myself oscillating between rage so sharp it burned my throat and a sorrow so deep it threatened to pull me into silence. One evening Lauren arrived with groceries, and though I might have been grateful for the gesture under other circumstances, I noticed the way she examined the expiration dates, shaking her head with theatrical disappointment, murmuring that I ought not be left alone to shop any more, that it was clear I was not keeping track. She whispered to her fiancé that I had forgotten essentials, though in truth I had not written a list because I knew she was coming, and I realized she was building a record, a trail of fabricated incompetence. Later, as we sat to eat, she remarked that I had repeated the same story about Margaret twice in 1 week, and her fiancé gave her a knowing glance, writing something into his phone as though he were compiling a report. I pretended not to notice, but inside me the fire grew, because I understood that every action, every word, was being twisted into evidence of decline, and it was only a matter of time before they attempted to wield that narrative in court. The escalation sharpened when Lauren produced a pamphlet she had collected, one describing a retirement facility in Ohio, with glossy photographs of smiling seniors on manicured lawns. She placed it before me at breakfast, sliding it across the table with a gentle smile that concealed her impatience, and she explained that such places offered safety, medical supervision, and community, that it would be good for me to be among others my age, that I would no longer have to worry about chores or loneliness. Her fiancé added that selling the house would more than cover the costs, that the remaining funds could be managed wisely, and I heard in his voice the hunger barely disguised by professional polish. I turned the pamphlet over slowly, studying the artificial images, the staged laughter of strangers who might well be prisoners in comfort, and I said nothing, because nothing I could have said in that moment would have pierced the shield of justification they had built for themselves. Inwardly, I was shaken not because the suggestion had merit, it did not, but because it revealed the nakedness of their intentions. They wanted me uprooted, removed from the place that still carried Margaret's breath, stripped from the house where every floorboard told the story of our years together, placed instead in a building that would isolate me while they dismantled my estate. The thought of dying in a place like that, of leaving behind the lake, the garden, the rooms where Margaret and I had woven our lives, filled me with a terror that no grave could match. I knew then that their patience was gone, that they were pushing forward with a plan that would soon crush me if I did not act decisively. The true escalation came when I received a call from my lawyer, his voice measured but concerned. He told me that someone had contacted his office, inquiring about the possibility of contesting my competency, asking what procedures were required to establish guardianship. He did not say outright that it was Lauren, but he did not need to. The timing, the language, the context all pointed in one direction. He warned me that if they proceeded, I would need to undergo evaluations, medical tests, perhaps even hearings. And though he reassured me that nothing he had seen in our meetings suggested incompetence, he advised vigilance. I thanked him, my hand trembling on the receiver, not from fear of the evaluations, but from the shock of hearing how far my daughter was willing to go, how openly she was preparing to strip me of personhood. That night I could not sleep. I paced the house, recalling the laughter of my grandchildren when they were small, the warmth of Christmas mornings, the smell of Margaret's pies, and I asked myself where the fracture had begun, when the line of love had turned into a line of greed. I thought of the times Margaret defended Lauren, excusing her absence, her abruptness, her preoccupation with work. And I wondered if Margaret had known deep down that this day might come, if she had tried to shield me from a truth she could not bear to face. At one point, I sat by the window overlooking the lake, watching the moon ripple on the water, and I whispered aloud that I was sorry. Sorry for failing as a father. Sorry that love had not been enough to shape a daughter into something more than hunger. The wind off the lake rattled the glass as if in response, and I swore again that I would not surrender, that if Lauren wanted to cast me as feeble, I would instead stand taller than I had in years. The next morning Lauren arrived with a new tactic, sweetness. She prepared breakfast, humming as though she were recreating Margaret's presence, serving me eggs and toast with a smile that was too wide, too polished. She asked how I slept, if I was comfortable, if I needed anything, and when I responded politely, she leaned forward and told me that she only wanted what was best for me, that she could not bear the thought of me struggling alone, that it broke her heart to see me diminished. Her words might have touched me once, years ago, but now they rang with falseness, each syllable echoing with the motive of control. She spoke of how she had always looked up to me, how she wanted to protect me, and yet her eyes darted toward the locked cabinet where I kept Margaret's documents, her gaze lingering as though she could see through wood and metal. I realized that she was not only trying to convince me, but to soften me, to lower my guard, to make me pliable enough to sign away everything under the weight of feigned affection. Later that day, I found evidence that shook me even more deeply. In the study drawer where I had left the insurance documents, I discovered that the papers had been disturbed, not in a careless way, but with precision, as though someone had opened them, studied them, and returned them with exacting care. The difference was subtle. An envelope turned slightly, a page folded differently. But I knew the rhythm of my own filing, and I recognized intrusion. My hands shook as I closed the drawer, understanding that while I slept under my own roof, my daughter and her fiancé had been treating the house not as a home, but as a vault, rifling through the remnants of my life like burglars disguised in filial clothing. The violation stung more than words could capture, and I felt Margaret's absence like a wound reopening, because had she been here, she would have defended me. She would have spoken with the kind of authority that even Lauren could not ignore. Alone, I had to carry the burden myself. The following week, Lauren pressed harder. She spoke openly of timelines, of decisions that needed to be made soon, of opportunities that might be lost if we delayed. Her fiancé grew bolder, asking directly about account numbers, balances, assets. At one point, he even suggested that I allow him temporary access to manage an investment, assuring me that it was only to keep the funds active, that I would benefit in the long run. I declined politely, but the request itself revealed the quickening pace of their ambition. They were no longer satisfied with waiting. They were circling, closing in, sensing that age itself would lend credibility to their claims. The moment that crystallized the second escalation came, when Lauren, perhaps tired of pretending, lost her temper. We were in the kitchen, and I had refused once again to discuss selling the house, saying only that it was too soon after Margaret's death, that I needed time. Her face hardened, and she snapped that I was being selfish, that I was clinging to the past, that my stubbornness was not only hurting me, but burdening her. She raised her voice, saying that she was the one making sacrifices, that she was the one who cared enough to step in, that if I truly loved her, I would trust her. Her fiancé tried to calm her, placing a hand on her arm, but she shook him off and continued, her words cutting like knives, painting me as an obstacle rather than a father. I stood there, silent, letting her fury echo, because in that moment she revealed herself more clearly than any secret conversation could. She no longer hid behind sweetness or care. She declared openly that my will, my independence, my very existence stood in the way of what she believed was hers. That night, alone in the house after they left, I sat with Margaret's photograph pressed to my chest, and I wept, not because of the money, not because of the property, but because I realized the last thread of illusion had snapped. Lauren was not misguided, not simply practical, not merely ambitious. She had chosen a path that placed greed above blood, calculation above memory, self-interest above love. The escalation had reached its peak. I was not fighting for assets. I was fighting for the last vestiges of dignity left to me, for the right to leave this world on my own terms, not as a puppet manipulated by those who should have been my protectors. The plan to declare me incompetent was no longer a shadow. It was a storm gathering over the lake, and I knew it would break soon. Yet in that knowledge I also found strength, because storms, no matter how fierce, can be weathered by those who stand firm. I resolved that night to meet the escalation not with despair, but with defiance. And as I drafted new instructions for my lawyer, detailing the changes to my will and the protections I wanted in place, I felt Margaret's spirit steadying my hand, guiding me, reminding me that even in betrayal there can be justice, even in solitude there can be victory. The day of reckoning arrived not with thunder or drama, but with the simple, ordinary act of Lauren setting the table for Sunday dinner, her movements brisk and purposeful, her fiancé uncorking a bottle of wine as if celebration were already guaranteed. And I sat there watching them with the calm of a man who has carried his secret close to his chest for weeks and is finally ready to let it breathe. I had invited them that morning with a tone of surrender, telling Lauren on the phone that I was ready to finalize things, that perhaps she had been right all along, that it was time to make decisions before confusion clouded my mind further. And the eagerness in her voice when she accepted the invitation was so sharp, I could almost hear the edges of victory slicing through the line. All afternoon, I prepared the house not with the dread of a victim, but with the precision of a soldier arranging the battlefield, ensuring the documents from my lawyer were neatly stacked in the drawer, the camera fully charged and aimed toward the table, the envelope containing the new will resting in my pocket, like a stone that anchored me to resolve. When they arrived, Lauren kissed my cheek with the tenderness of an actress in her finest role, and her fiancé clapped me on the shoulder, his smile too broad, too rehearsed, and I felt a strange detachment as though I were observing them from outside myself. as though I had finally stepped beyond the reach of their manipulations. Dinner passed in a blur of small talk, the food tasting of nothing, my ears filled only with the sound of their voices circling closer and closer to the subject they were desperate to broach. At last, when the plates were cleared, Lauren unfolded the familiar leather folder with the precision of a magician preparing the final trick, sliding the documents across the table toward me, her eyes bright with anticipation. Her fiancé leaning forward with a fountain pen already uncapped, and she said softly, "Dad, we should do this now, while you're clear, before anything changes." I looked down at the pages, the same poisonous words dressed in legal language, and I let my fingers rest upon them long enough for her to believe I was ready to yield. I lifted my eyes slowly, meeting hers, and for the first time in years I allowed the full weight of my disappointment to show, not anger, not sorrow, but the heavy truth of a man who has seen through the mask of his own child and found only hunger beneath. She shifted in her chair, unsettled, perhaps sensing that something in the air had changed, but her fiancé quickly filled the silence, urging me to sign, speaking of responsibility, of protection, of the dangers of delay. I picked up the pen, turning it between my fingers, and then, with a steady hand that belied the years etched into my skin, I pushed the papers back across the table and said in a voice quiet but unyielding, "No. Tonight it is my turn to speak." Before they could respond, I reached into my pocket and drew out the envelope, laying it flat upon the table, and I told them that I had already changed my will, that everything Margaret and I had built together had been secured in a trust that bore her name, and that the income from that trust would go not to greedy hands, but to children who had none, to scholarships for those who had been abandoned by family, to causes that would honor the woman who had given me her life. I told them that their names appeared nowhere within it, that not a single coin, not a single brick of this house, not a single drop of what Margaret and I had earned through decades of work would pass into their keeping. Lauren's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief, while her fiancé's eyes narrowed into something predatory, and for a moment the silence between us felt like the crack before an earthquake. Then, with deliberate calm, I pressed a button on the small remote beside me, and the screen flickered to life with the recording I had captured weeks earlier. Their voices filled the room, Lauren insisting that I was slipping, that it would be easy to have me declared incompetent, her fiancé urging patience, both of them laughing as they imagined the ease with which my estate could be seized. The sound echoed against the walls, every word a nail in the coffin of their performance, and I sat back watching their faces crumble, Lauren's composure disintegrating into rage, her fiancé attempting to mask his shock with indignation, and I felt not triumph but a grim justice, the justice of truth laid bare in the presence of those who believed themselves untouchable. Lauren leapt from her chair, shouting that I had betrayed her, that I was cruel, that I was choosing strangers over my own blood, and her voice cracked with fury as she accused me of manipulation, of fabrication, of madness. Her fiancé rose more slowly, his eyes darting to the documents, realizing with growing panic that their entire scheme had collapsed, that not only had I refused them, but that I had evidence strong enough to destroy their credibility should they attempt to challenge me. I let them rage, let them spew accusations, and when at last their voices faltered, I spoke again, this time with the clarity of a man who had nothing left to fear. I told them that family is not defined by inheritance, that love cannot be purchased or coerced, that the moment they chose to treat me as prey rather than parent, they severed the bond that had once tied us. For a long moment there was only silence, broken by the sound of Lauren's breathing, ragged and uneven, and then she turned on her heel, sweeping from the house with her fiancé trailing behind her, his polished smile long gone, his eyes dark with humiliation. The door slammed, the echo reverberating through the rooms like the final note of a song that had been building for too many years. And I sat there alone at the table, the remnants of dinner before me, the envelope still resting by my hand. And for the first time since Margaret's death, I felt not grief, but release. It was not victory in the sense of triumph, for no father truly wins when he casts out his child. But it was victory in the sense of justice, the preservation of dignity, the defense of a memory that deserved more than betrayal. I rose slowly, my joints aching, my body weary, and I carried the envelope to Margaret's photograph on the mantel. I laid it beneath her frame, whispering that I had kept my promise, that I had not allowed them to tarnish her legacy. And I felt the heaviness in my chest ease, as though she had answered, as though she had acknowledged that in this final battle I had stood not only for myself, but for the love we had shared. That night I sat by the lake, the stars reflected on the water like scattered diamonds, and I thought of the silence that had haunted me since Margaret's passing. For the first time, it did not feel like emptiness. It felt like peace, the quiet that follows a storm when the air is clear and the world, though scarred, feels somehow renewed. I knew the road ahead would be lonely, that Lauren's absence would carve fresh wounds in the fabric of my days. But I also knew that I had chosen truth over submission, honor over compromise, and in that knowledge I found strength enough to face whatever years remained. In the days that followed their departure, the house seemed quieter than it had ever been. Yet the silence no longer pressed against me, like a suffocating weight, but instead drifted around me like a companion that had finally learned how to be gentle. For years I had feared solitude, imagining it as a void that would consume me once Margaret was gone. But in truth, the greater void had been the presence of people who no longer loved me, but only lingered near for what they could take. And now that they were gone, the rooms of my home seemed to exhale, the walls no longer listening to deceit, the floorboards no longer straining under footsteps that carried greed rather than care. I moved through the house slowly, touching the familiar objects that remained mine, not in the sense of ownership, but in the sense of memory. Each chair, each photograph, each dish carrying Margaret's voice. And for the first time since her death, those voices brought comfort rather than pain. News travels quickly in small towns, and before long neighbors who had attended Margaret's funeral began to call or stop by, some under the pretense of checking in, others out of genuine warmth. And I realized that the story of Lauren's outburst at Sunday dinner had already begun to ripple through the community. I did not share the recordings, nor did I expose her schemes to anyone beyond my lawyer, for what would be the point of humiliating her further? The truth was already written in her absence, in the empty chair that would never again be filled by her presence. The neighbors spoke of her with cautious sympathy, saying perhaps grief had made her reckless, that perhaps time would heal, and I nodded politely. But deep inside, I knew that what had broken could not be mended, that trust once shattered is not repaired by excuses, that family once abandoned does not return to the same shape it had before. My lawyer assured me that the trust was ironclad, that no challenge could overturn the documents I had signed with full clarity of mind, and he commended me quietly for having taken action before matters spiraled further. I thanked him, but said little, for what words could capture the strange mixture of loss and relief that filled me? Yes, I had protected Margaret's legacy. Yes, I had safeguarded the fruits of our labor. Yes, I had refused to be erased. But the price of that defense was the confirmation that my daughter's heart no longer held me as a father. The papers in his office were strong enough to defend my estate, but they could not repair the absence of love, and I carried that absence with me like a scar that no one else could see. One afternoon, while sorting through Margaret's old sewing kit, I found a small envelope tucked at the bottom, her handwriting on the front, faded but still familiar. And when I opened it, I discovered a note written during her illness. In it, she told me that she worried about me, that she feared loneliness would consume me after she was gone, that she hoped I would remember not only the pain of her absence, but also the joy of all we had shared. And she ended with a single line that pierced me more deeply than any betrayal. Walter, promise me you will not let them turn our love into currency. I sat there in the sunlight streaming through the window, the paper trembling in my hands, and I whispered aloud that I had kept that promise, that whatever else I had failed at, in this I had been faithful. The seasons shifted, the leaves turning, the lake freezing, the snow falling heavy and then melting into spring, and I found myself growing older in the steady rhythm of nature, no longer fearing each day as a burden, but greeting it as a gift still left to me. I tended to the garden Margaret had loved, though my knees protested, and I fed the birds that gathered on the porch, and I discovered that even in the absence of family, life could still hold small graces. A widow from down the road, kind and soft-spoken, began to visit more often, bringing pies or flowers, and though nothing could ever replace what I had lost, her company reminded me that not all bonds are broken, that not all love is tainted, that sometimes kindness comes from places we least expect. As for Lauren, I have not heard from her since that night, and I do not expect to. Perhaps she tells her story differently, casting me as stubborn or cruel. Perhaps she nurses her anger like a flame. Perhaps she has already moved on to another ambition. But it no longer matters, because I have chosen peace over pursuit, memory over conflict, and I know that chasing reconciliation, where there is only greed, would be to dishonor myself and Margaret both. If one day she returns, if remorse softens her heart, I will listen, but I will not forget, and I will not surrender again the dignity I fought so hard to preserve. Now when I walk to the cemetery and stand before Margaret's stone, I no longer tremble with the weight of loneliness. I place flowers at her name and speak softly, telling her of the days, of the birds, of the quiet that has become bearable, and I feel in the wind that she hears me still. The money, the property, the legacy, it is safe, yes, but more importantly, the promise between us is unbroken. I may have lost a daughter to greed, but I did not lose myself. And I did not lose the truth of the love that defined my life. That, in the end, is enough.